Javier, look, it's Samuel Barnes. You came to Virginia. How you doing, Javier?
Hello, everyone.
He's muted. Cheaton's here too. Good old Cheaton. Hey, Javier, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. What's up, guys?
Oh, we're good. We've forced Samuel to help us plant flowers. He just had to nanny the children for 30 minutes as we went and get the car. We're getting a lot out of this London air, so it's been great. It's been really good. Cheaton, good to see you, sir. So Sam's got to come by more often. This Barnes is great. And we had a wonderful conversation. Oh, Cheaton's got the coolest background. He's running from the law. Cheaton's running from the law.
I'm just driving. I keep my camera off. Yeah.
No problem. He's like, I'm running from the law. That's great. No, he's running from the singularity. That's what he's doing. He doesn't want to lose his job. He's he's fleeing. Hey, Javier, tell me about philosopher preachers or we can talk about aliens. Because Samuel and Mr. Barnes and I had a great talk with Raymond on friggin' aliens and how the fact that we see them as scientific and technological is kind of a wish fulfillment for us to believe that technology is the way, and how we have no problem with conspiracies that go back in time. Raymond made this point. We have no problems with conspiracies that go back and say, like, publicly and socially, and maybe you can talk about that distinction, Mr. Barnes, because I really like that point you made, on, like, it's totally okay to talk about, like, aliens building the pyramids or behind ancient aliens, like aliens doing everything in the past. But any sort of, like, conspiracy that questions science, like the moon landing or anything like that, is, like, crazy, or flat Earth. But conspiracies that, like, reify science, I always wonder if I'm using the term reify correctly. I think I read the dictionary right. But that make science look good, STEM, is okay. And it's interesting because, like, if you looked in the past and said, oh, all the great accomplishments back there were able without science and technology, that might draw into question science and technology now. So it's kind of interesting, that bias toward conspiracies we like. So aliens is a great topic, and we can talk about what we think about aliens. But also, I really liked your piece on the philosopher preacher. So that was very nice. I caught him right when he went to drink. He's like, oh my God, aliens are preachers, philosophers.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so, all right, I'll try to address these things. So aliens, that's interesting. It's funny to me because the concept of divinity is kind of already in the alien realm.
Sure.
Right? This idea that there's aliens, for me, is just another term for what? Non-human, right? It's non-human. There is something beyond this. But it's funny that the discourse revolves around what you're saying, reifying science, right? Whereas in some people's mind, God has already failed to reify science. So aliens is the next logical step to reify science. Right. And I know there's much to say on that, but I will briefly comment on the preacher philosopher. The preacher philosopher was kind of an idea that I had about how it really had to do with, like, my own paying attention to my own disinterest and interest in certain topics. Like, I would consider myself more as, like, a thinker of, like, themes. Universal themes like love, courage, hope, so on. The varying difference is that philosophers like going into depth about these themes, you know, the beauty, the good, so on. But for me, the preacher philosopher is more like this idea of repetition and drive for wanting to think these topics again. So in some sense, even though I didn't directly address this in my piece, hopefully I can address this in another piece, that in some sense, all philosophers kind of act like preachers, and then all preachers kind of act like philosophers, where just the idea that we attempt to think already ignites some repetition in thought, right? That it inspires you to want to attack this topic again. But yeah, I'll just leave it there.
I like that, and I'll give it to Dimitri and Mr. Jock and Emilio. Good to see you. And I love how when Mr. Jockin heard aliens, his eyebrows went up. He's like, "Oh, all right, the net is venturing. Good times."
Actually, it was just interrupted. It was very appropriate because I was meditating on our conversation we had a couple of sessions ago about otherness versus difference. So that's why this caught my. I was meditating in the shower about this morning. Actually, this is very appropriate. But Dimitri, the floor is yours.
Well, I think that proves alien telekinesis, Mr. Jockin. I think we've just confirmed it. I love the point you made about God, and he failed to like glorify science, so aliens will do it. That's interesting. In the preacher philosopher distinction, it's like the philosopher keeps revisiting what he thought and reapplying it and rethinking it. There's interesting about that. But Dimitri, it's good to see you today, sir. I enjoyed our talk the other day. That was really a real blast.
Oh yes, that was a blast. That was very nice. That was fucking overwhelming, guys. That was when that talk is out, like that's definitely the best podcast episode on my channel as of yet. It was really an explosion, and not only Daniel joined, but also Cadell, also Layman Pascal, and we talked about religion and spirituality for the 21st century. A very bombastic title because I always like bombastic things. So anyway, I didn't want to talk about that, even though I'm gonna plug it because this talk was so amazing. You don't miss out on this talk whenever it's uploaded. But I actually recently I woke up and then I was so angry. Why? Because not only because every day is the same, you wake up and you gotta go and struggle, but also because there was this word that was on my mind. And the obsessional neurotic, like there's a difference between obsessional neurosis and hysteria. For Freud, in that the hysteric, basically what happens if there's some kind of trauma, the hysteric will actually convert it into a bodily symptom. So things that, like you might get very tensed up, you might get weird physical symptoms, but the obsessional neurotic actually converts this in an ideal way. So it's like you become obsessed about a certain idea, right? And some people become obsessed and then they start building like a whole train, how do you say it? Like a whole train theme park in the top of their on the top of their house because they have to be occupied with something. Now, okay, Daniel's just pointing the fingers already. But anyway, what was my problem? Well, I was thinking about this word. It's called a hobby, and I was super angry at this word, a hobby, because I thought I never had a hobby in my goddamn life. I never had a hobby when I was gaming, when I was doing drugs, whenever I was doing whatever stupid shit I was doing, or maybe exalted things sometimes. I just want to die, and I want to die for it, and I want to die with it. And maybe I find out it's not the thing eventually, but like a hobby, it's like if you say it's just a hobby, it's such a way to limit yourself, because if it's a hobby, it's not something you die for it. And I really think like I do rap music, right? And really, so I released this song, and I felt like I want to die, but like I'm putting myself on the line, I guess. At least I'm trying to. And so I'm not saying my rap music is a hobby because I mean, of course I want to be the greatest rapper that there ever was. I'm not gonna be because I mean, if you guys listen to Eminem and all the other rappers, it's fucking insanity how far people go nowadays. But yeah, so if you got some art project or some creative stuff, never reduce it to a hobby, please. Please don't do it, because like stake your life on the line and say this is me and I love this and I wouldn't see the point of life if it wasn't for this thing. Like it can even be, it can even be some kind of silly thing, I think this is also why I love joking about Hegel and not to take it all too seriously, even though it's the thing I would take most seriously too. But yeah, for example, dancing, dancing is not a hobby. Dancing is way too beautiful to be a hobby. That's what I think. So that's just that's my rant, guys. You can see I'm getting very excited. My blood pressure is actually going up right now, so I will stop talking. Thanks for listening.
I love that, Dimitri. I'll give it to Mr. Barnes here. It is extremely interesting to figure out the right relationship to your projects and your work. Like everyone knows there's a zillion whiplash, black swan, like, obsession leading to craziness. But then there's also a shallowness that seems really problematic. And then there's also kind of like if you really care about it, wouldn't you pour yourself into it entirely? And maybe it's not so much the problem of maybe it's something where the issue is not so much of pouring yourself entirely into something, but not training yourself to be the kind of subject that can pour yourself entirely into something. But you really ultimately do want to do that, but you also want to be the person that can handle it. It's almost like in a lot of those movies, you have someone who pours themselves entirely into something, but doesn't work on themselves as a subject to be able to do that. I'm curious, because I agree, the word hobby is so problematic. And then also, it would be interesting, entertainment, hobby, call, passion, all of those things are interesting. And maybe part of the problem with the alien stuff is that like humanity treats aliens like a hobby every summer when ratings are down on TV and they need more clicks, like that Eric Hole guy was saying. And the problem is we don't seriously think about it, because maybe that's what we need to do to really think it through, or to be shucking out of our dogmatic slumber, or to realize the whole thing is crazy. So I'm curious on that. And then, is the preacher philosopher engaged in hobby or something they'll die for? I really like the topic of hobby, and I really like your hat, Dimitri. That's super cool. Mr. Barnes.
Hello.
Hello, Mr. Barnes. How you doing?
I'm good, yeah. I did want to comment on what Javier was saying about the whole alien thing, you know. I think he's definitely right. I think I agree with. And this is at risk of stepping on religious toes here.
Nice.
But I think that humans have a like innate wanting for the outside, I think in modernity that manifests itself as a longing for things not of this world. Like it's almost like there would be a sense of disappointment if we found out that this is all there is, and whether that relates to God or whether that relates to life in other parts of the universe. And that's very like demonstrable, because when we imagine life in other parts of the universe, we imagine them as much more enlightened, much more technologically like in the future. This almost takes on like a liberatory like aspect to it.
Yeah,
like it's not like oh, we'd be so overjoyed by finding like a caveman race somewhere that we can enslave. I think, and it's maybe a reflection of the fact that we're fallible creatures, that we sort of are longing for something that is perfect, is perfection. And I think that applies to the idea of God and heaven as much as it does to the eschatology of science, which is alien life or time travel or whatever. And yeah, I thought, Dimitri, I can relate to your feelings a lot, and you put the point kind of very viscerally. I think the word hobby is very interesting, and you brought up the word passion, Daniel, because hobby is like it consumerizes things. It relates to the accumulation of things. Like when someone says, "Oh, my hobby is like train sets," there is like a a static room that is full of toys, which for them to partake, for these objects to partake in a sense of being, they have to be played with. But often these things are static and kept pristine. So I think hobby is a very consumerized thing, as well as I think the word passion is quite interesting, because that's another thing that's been sublimated, and I think it's very, very apparent in I don't know what you call them in the US, but sort of the essays you send to a university, like a mission essay. You're like, oh, I've always had a passion for so and so subject, and I think it very much castrates the topic. Like people are often, I think the real people, the original like impetus for people being interested in stuff like science, and the reason they should be interested in science is that they really want to push the limit of our worldly knowledge, and it becomes sublimated into, oh, I have a passion for, I don't know, Neil deGrasse Tyson and
lizards.
And lizards, yeah. But I think philosophy is a unique case as it is the meta question. And I think Dimitri's spot on in saying that it's right not to think of it as a hobby. And I think unfortunately the gate is very very thin. I think the majority of people who pick up philosophy as an interest, which I think lots of people do, it stays as an interest. It stays as a strange curiosity on the edge of their lives, and all the things they do and continue to do, and all the post hoc rationalizations they continue to make don't really change. I mean, and that was the case for me around 4 years ago when I picked up philosophy on the side of my career as an interest. But eventually I feel like I was capable to go through philosophy, and it's much more of a sort of lived, embodied experience now. Like like Dimitri was saying, like when philosophy is approached correctly, and you actually feel the thing, you actually feel it, like the collapse of, for example, like to take the collapse of Christianity that Nietzsche would talk about, like that is a like morbid interest in like philosophy departments. But if you actually go through that, you actually feel a grief, you actually feel a loss if you lose those sorts of axioms. It doesn't just apply to Christianity, it applies to lots of things. And I feel that's the experience I had with philosophy. People have different experiences with philosophy, but I feel like if it's done properly, if it's approached honestly, because it is a meta question and it affects everything in our lives, and every single thing you do as a human subject, you do as a philosophical subject. If you genuinely approach the topic, it has a visceral effect on you.
This is really interesting. I'm going to give it to Javier, Dimitri, and then Mr. Jockin. So is like aliens the collective hobby of humanity? You keep it on the fringe. You don't really think it, but it always gives you something kind of passive. I'm plugging the aliens as much as possible. I'm also really interested now, this difference between like hobby as collection and hobby as skill. Like it used to be that a hobby was, say, you learn how to make chairs, right? Now a hobby is you collect Thomas the Tank Engine sets.
That's not, I think you create chairs, right? That's a craft.
Sure. Well, but this is the thing. In the American lexicon, a lot of people say, oh, I have a hobby. And today they mean to collect things. Yeah. But when I speak to older people and they talk about having a hobby, they literally like crafted chairs. But
this is what I mean by the language has been sublimated.
Yes.
So I think it's more correct to say like craft.
Very fair. Very fair. But what's very interesting is now I'm wondering, is the problem, so we all know about all the stereotypical people, someone pours themselves into something and they go crazy, right? But then there's also this problematic, like you keep it on the edge and it doesn't really become you.
Yeah.
What if the problem, and then I'll pass it on, is the difference between, it's not like the person obsessed with trains is like, I'm going to go like be a train conductor and I'm going to do the work of learning how to do trains. It becomes like, I'll collect trains. And that seems to be the kind of hoarding, like problematic relation to it, as opposed to I will pour myself into a skill. And maybe what capitalism has done is gradually moved us thinking of hobbies away from craft into consumerism. And that's where then even like in a movie like Whiplash, there's really more of a trying to collect status. And maybe in academia, rather than like learning the skill of thinking, you're collecting citations. So maybe the kind of problematic is when you pour yourself entirely into collecting as opposed to becoming. So maybe there's something there that's a very interesting thought.
But ultimately,
can I just respond to that?
Please.
Because Freud had a word for this. It's called anal. It's called an anal personality. It's that, like, if you're obsessed with collecting, for Freud, that means something went wrong at the anal stage. Like when you were smearing poop as a 2-year-old and showing your mom because you were very proud of what you did. And actually, it's different. That's just a joke. But it's also something that happens, of course. But no, actually, like this, the infant can get an enjoyment out of not pooping. Why? Because the mother tells the infant, please poop. And then the infant is like, no, I'm just going to hold it in as long as I can, because then I'm asserting my power over a finite existence as an infinite and free subject. This is what infants do, and this is what they think. And collecting things is like collecting shit in a sense. It's really fascinating. But yeah, I mean, it's even like in the normal language these days. It's like, oh, he's such an anal person. But Freud's kind of getting at this. What's also interesting about the hobby things is that in Dutch we actually say hobby, which is a loan word from English. So we never had a word for this. We have like a word for craft, like something you do for that. But hobby is from English. Daniel, to your point also, Zizek has this very interesting quote that we shouldn't read over too quickly. He says, repetition demands the greatest creative effort. Now, this should dawn us as strange. Why? Because why wouldn't it be the opposite? That would be a more like intuitively graspable thing to say. Like, repetition or like creativity demands repetitive effort. Well, Zizek is saying the exact opposite. So it's repetition that demands the most creative effort. And what does this mean? Well, I'm sure that I'm not completely sure what it means. I think it's very fascinating to think about, but I'm sure it has something to do with the fact that, you know, if you would go to any great rapper, they can just freestyle in front of you without any problem, and they can just tap into that flow state without needing much. Whereas if you would ask me, it depends on my mood, you know. And also, it wouldn't be of that quality like as an Eminem or something, or someone like this could do. So those are just some points on everything that has been said.
Lovely. So now I'm thinking that I'll give it back to you. Now and then I'll give it to Javier and Mr. Joggin. Now I'm thinking, so America's problem is that it can't poop. And that what if aliens is like we want an eschatology, so we're looking for that, which is like we want history to poop. And so we're really constipated. So aliens are eschatological. I can't say that word. Eschatological constipation. Yeah, that was close, right? Or different things. It's very, and it is a kind of rebellion where you hold it in. And there's a kind of catharsis. That's it. But what were you saying, Mr. Barnes?
Yeah, I know. I kind of wanted to put a pin in that point, or at least to clarify myself, is that to use the Freudian language is a very, it's a good way of explaining it. Train sets are ultimately retentive when it comes to being an adult. Like, it relates to the anal stage, like I think specifically. And it's it's castrated in the fact that it doesn't have any sort of telos. Like I said, it's a static thing that happens in attics and garages. And the flip side of that is what you said. Being a train conductor is vitalistic, and it's
interesting.
It's going out into the world. It's trains moving around, trains breaking down, all these sorts of things. So yeah, that's kind of. I hope that puts a pin in it.
I agree. I'm going to give it to Javier. Michelle put it well. So it's eschatological. If you're a trained conductor, it's eschatological. I can't say this word, excretion. So that's really good. And also, I want to say, and Dimitri, and that's right. But let me give it to Javier and then Mr. Jockin.
So actually, I want to provoke. I want to make this more complexifying in the sense that I think the notion of hobby has to do with more of an economic guilt, right? That you couldn't do this in your own life economically. So now it's reduced to a hobby, right? This is something I experienced with my own family. Like, oh yeah, but that's not really realistic. You can't really do that as a job. So just keep it as a hobby, right? And if we want to stay with the verbiage of constipation, they're basically saying you can never poop it out. You have to keep it in. Right? So you have to keep it as a hobby. So it has to do, in my opinion, with more of an economic guilt because the failure of exchange is inevitable. You can't ever do anything with your hobby. It has to just remain as such. But there is this interesting dialogue that we're having with collection versus craft. I think this notion of collection has to do more with nostalgia than crafting. I think the capitalistic relations has to do, it basically feeds this thing where it's like, you can't do anything with this. But what you can get through this consumerist exchange is a priceless nostalgia for it. So you'll just keep collecting and keep collecting because it feeds off of the nostalgia for the person, right? Like for me, like collecting Pokemon cards, that's nostalgia. For me, that's just like pure nostalgia for people. But then they also do like collecting to get money, right? So it still has to do with some type of exchange. But I think the logic of exchange is very intimately connected to the notion of hobby. And the moment that we start talking about exchange, we have to talk about guilt. Because guilt is what ultimately feeds exchange. The problem is that, like Buber, I recently read this wonderful passage on Buber. Buber says guilt is there because the man is still concerned with himself. And this is what the economic failure of hobby does to a person. Society says you can't do anything with this outside of your own self. So you must remain with oneself. And so it is then reduced to a hobby as such. But this is debilitating. This is like a kind of like I don't know, Jungian like failed risk-taking maneuver where the person shrinks themselves and decides to remain there, right? The hobby must remain as hobby because to extend it any further means to take a risk, possibly burn, possibly go crazy, possibly be homeless, and so on. So there is something about hobby and guilt that are intimately related to each other that has to do with the logic of exchange. Now, this is where the other gets into conversation, because the only way to get rid of the guilt is to understand that the exchange is always the other. You and the other is always the exchange, but we think it's what the other exchanges that we are consumed with. And this is why when parents say you can't do anything with that hobby is because they're saying that people are not going to buy your artwork. It might be garbage. You might not be able to do anything with it, right? So they're concerned about the exchange itself rather than understanding that it's, in fact, the encounter with the other that is the exchange. So there's a lot of topics to go off of here. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
So crapping is crafting. Really like it. And I just love imagine. I'll give it to Mr. Jock. And Cheaton is in that car like, hurry up, hurry up. They're talking about conspiracies, aliens, and crapping. We can't miss it. It's greatest net title ever. I really like this idea of hobby as like keeping it distant. Because it's like you got to keep it in. But I wonder if there's also to the point, I think that's exactly right. And there's also a fear that, well, what if they treat the hobby like something they pour themselves into? What if they get lost in it and go crazy? So let's keep it at a distance. But then that's almost like we've got to learn. That's not the right approach, though. It's like in Dante learning where you see the hiddenness of God is to give you time to condition yourself for more of it. So likewise, maybe the issue is like, if you're going to pour into a hobby, we don't have structures and maybe apprenticeship to learn how to gradually pour more and more of yourself into it so it doesn't destroy you, kind of like a Dante model of the gradual revealing of God's hiddenness. So I'm curious about this, Mr. Jockin. It is good to see you, sir. I'm glad we're talking about aliens.
I don't know, fun, right? Well, I mean, by the way, I mean, I appreciate this hilarious eschatology excretion discussion. I have to, I mean, yeah, right? Isn't this hilarious? Because, by the way, like, when the original context of the other was not just God, but also angels. And also there's a lot of arguments about the angels were just representation. Like if it had been collapsed into alien sightings in the past. And how boring. It is, I mean, as stated, how disappointing that we basically collapsed the spiritual domain into just spaceships. I mean, it is kind of disappointing, isn't it? I'm going to take that and put that on the side for a minute. I just want to comment. I do appreciate this exchange. I like that riff, the fun jazz riff on that. I want to pick, this whole thing about hobby and commitment. I'm Dimitri's gone, but I think it's right. You can make arguments on both sides. And as been stated, like there's the idea of, actually, by the way, I like what hobby introduced because I think it's very fair to say the spirit of the age. If I had to summarize what capitalism is, and that's always very difficult. Accumulation, for accumulation's sake. If I had to summarize it, basically everything must not. So it's like a thrusting not of the sign of just quantity versus quality as a first move, but then that's not even good enough. Now we just have to have no depth, like endless running of accumulation. I mean, to be frank, in business, that's how it goes. It's basically everything is basically an exchanging of accumulations. You have to have something to exchange for another accumulation, time, property, assets, whatever it is. And even and hustle culture, by the way, is basically this kind of accumulation of hobbies, right? And by the way, I mean, and I actually like this also another note too. Notice that all these accumulations are outside you. It's gatherings outside you. I just bring this up because I think even our mode of knowledge, right? Because the idea is like any instrument we use for knowledge now, whether it be papers or whatever, it's always something we don't ever change. The knowledge is there and we're just observing it from the outside. It doesn't color us or change us. I'm just saying this in the sense of, I'm just bringing up, I'm kind of tangent noting that just on the point of paper, basically like professors who just do things for paper publishing, for example. I'm reminded from Daniel's comment about that. versus actually being changed by the things you're discovering or understanding versus just an accumulation. And by the way, actually, this leads to my note about all of this. It seems to be maybe the question of love is the thrusting point of it, especially the Aristotelian mode of friendship, right? In terms of pleasure, utility, and virtue. You know, basically, if you're just accumulating stuff for distraction's sake of pleasure, right? It actually has no utility. So it's like the Funko Pops. You're just literally accumulating Funko Pops. And then you have this like bizarre accumulation. I have friends who have this problem, and it is a problem. Just they have a whole room dedicated with Funko Pops and figurines and all this stuff. Zero utility. It's literally just an accumulation of distraction. That's all it is. And then there's I'd argue the scientist or the professor who's just publishing papers for the publish it. It's just an accumulation of utility. We're just gathering these things to get something out of it. And it's just like, what do you do? It's in both those cases, it's the predication is what does it do for me? Right? What's the benefit to me? But then there's virtue, right? The idea is like, ideally, any crafts, practice, or whatever, ideally it's a kind of, shall we say, what do I need to do for it? Versus what does it give me? It's kind of like, I mean, for anyone who's ever disciplined in anything, and by the way, like parallel, I mean, the issue of the economic supporting issue, unfortunately, there's been so much discussed. I can't talk about everything at once. I don't want to hog the time to reply everybody, but I will say this: as someone who, like, in my professional career, I'm a designer, I teach, but also I box, and I don't box for a career. Like, I don't do this for money, but I absolutely love it. And in fact, I'm still motivated to train and still do it, even if I'm not competing for fights. And because I very much found that the craft and discipline gave me something. I was chipped and changed by it, and I love it. And actually, by the way, I love teaching it. Like, I get excited when I see like one of my cousins, my nephews or cousins want to learn how to box. I'm like, I get all excited because and that's the thing I'm going to close with. Javier said something about exchange on guilt. And I know he's quoting other people on that. You know, it's interesting because I have to do a professional practices course this fall, and I pulled out my Aristotle, my ethics, Nicomachean ethics, and I pulled up the justice section, and it was really interesting what Aristotle said about it, because justice is related to the exchange, basically the interactions with others. So it's specifically on this virtue. It's the interactions of virtue with others, basically, and subdivided down to special justice with distributions, basically of honors and goods, things like that. But there's something that's absent from what Aristotle is talking about, and also the gift side. Although you can make an argument, you can debate this, but I've been meditating on this, especially on my lecture series I'm working on, The Beautiful and Virtue, is the metaphysics of the gift. Because a gift is something, in one sense, you can make an argument, a gift, it would be a guilt-based system, right? So you're doing something and it has this kind of demand to be repaid in the future. But is that really a gift, or is that something else? That would be my question. A gift should be, I mean, it's basically, especially, and I think about, and kind of use a theological account and close on this, right? It basically, we're in debt to God, right? If you use a Christian or Islamic or Jewish argument, that monotheistic argument, if basically we're in debt to God and there's absolutely nothing we have or could do that could repay that debt, our existence in life is thus a gift, because there's absolutely nothing, we can never be repaid. And then, by the way, I mean, I think about this in examples when people self-sacrifice their lives to save someone else. You can't repay that. How can you repay that? It actually puts a demand. Now, one can make an argument that causes a kind of neurosis gift, kind of like a guilt dynamic, but I'm not necessarily sure about that. I love to hear Javier's points about this, because I think this tension of the gift of what is its metaphysical properties, because I also say this, kind of tying all back to the original beginning, is that the issue of we always demand or want to circumscribe reality, and the spiritual is always kind of calling us to say something more is there. And I feel like the gift, if we understand and investigate it, might be a sign or a sign of that. And I also like that note about reification. Basically, have a problem. We constantly have that problem of reifying our signs and trying to lock it in, which reminded me of Meno. I'm reading that. I'm writing the essay right now about it. The note of knowledge being literally, he talked about beautiful, basically using a metaphor of beautiful statues, right? Beautiful sculptures. And right opinion, we may get a glimpse. By the way, everyone here in the Lack Boys, we're all here together. That, and Aristotle says at the end of Meno about this, that right opinion is a kind of glimpsing of a beautiful statue, right, of a beauty, but it doesn't stay still for us. We need to chain it down. He literally uses the language, chain it down with knowledge. And thus the distinction between right opinion and knowledge is this stability and chaining of the beauty, of the beautiful of statue he uses. But then I meditate on this and chew on it. Is that really, that's kind of the same analogy as like trying to capture a living animal by taxidermying it. Like, yeah, you caught it and you captured it, you locked it in, but it's no longer alive. So it's not really the same thing now anymore, is it? Which does lead me to a point of repetition and sameness over time. Anyways, I'm done. I'm going to leave it. I'm going to throw it out the window now.
That was outstanding. So there's a few things. First off, I like to imagine you walking down the sidewalk and in a conversation, you throw off your bookcase and you're able to pull out Aristotle just like that. Like, bam, just pull it out. I'll give it to Emilio and Mr. Javier Rivera. Good to see you, Emilio. Always a pleasure. I'm now thinking about The Gift of Death by Derrida. I know Javier has been doing work on this as well. And it's interesting. Maybe the only true gift humans can be is death, where what makes God God is that he can give a gift and not die. Like, we're humans to give like a gift in this metaphysical sense. Mr. Fishman, good to see you, sir. They have to die, where God's able to give a gift and not die in that kind of metaphysics of gift. That's really interesting. A few more things. There is something about collecting that kills, right? That's like really problematic. And there is something as well where now if we, Mr. Fishman, we've been talking about this difference between like developing a skill and how that changes you, and then like a hobby that is, collecting. Like differences, like in American culture, we say, oh, you have a hobby if you collect things like trains, but we don't consider it like a hobby as so much as like developing a skill, which shows this kind of change in the society. Brandon, good to see you, sir. And so we're talking about that, and there's a few things. One, there's something about the hobby good to see you, Brandon. Hobby that functions as a kind of revelation of the possibility of working outside a system or working on your own. So then we want to treat a hobby like something that doesn't matter. So it's like a distance. So you're kind of distancing yourself from the revelation of the quote unquote hobby, which is the possibility of working on yourself. Right. Whereas the system may want you to only work to the degree it contributes to consumerism or buying or different things like that. So maybe part of it is distancing the hobby away, so that that possibility of working on the self goes away. Also, I really like this point, like on the idea that there's ramifications here in love, because there's a difference between love as collecting a spouse versus love, which is opening you up to a mystery that changes you, right? Like, is love a kind of mystery that changes you as a subject in your horizon, or is love where you collect someone? Right? Or collecting experiences. And we also talked about the difference between academic collection of citations as opposed to like learning to change your horizon and experience, right? So there's something there on that that's very interesting to me. And there does seem to be also like the possibility of doing a work that changes you, as opposed to only doing a work that consumes. So there's something there as well, in where then if we just treat a hobby as kind of distance from it, like pulling away, we don't get that distinction and can participate in that. But let me give it to Mr. Emilio and Javier. Mr. Emilio, it is good to see you today, my friend.
Hello, good to see you. Fascinating talk as always, and I really like that aliens were mentioned up, because they are like a really good, interesting topic, and they relate with like interesting with the topic, because just like a quick thought that I wanted to share, because I think it's interesting. Like when we say aliens, it would not only resignify what we like, if our hobby as humans is to think of aliens. That would be really interesting, because not only it resignifies like what, like in the scope of the conversation, of course, like a hobby, but I always thought that if aliens like are true, like they break so many things, like in particular, like so many religions, like if you have Bible and they like, you like God make humans, but then you see like there are aliens with tentacles, like that doesn't seem like, you know, like it breaks so much. Like, did God create them? Like lie in the scripture? Or like if we eventually go to another planet and like they say like Jesus will come again, but like if we are all on, like if every person is on Mars, like he will come to Mars, or will he come to Earth and like no one will be there? So I think that's like a really interesting thing, and it relates back that, for example, religion is not a hobby, right? Because and I think like you have religion and you don't get anything economic out of it. But you like there are not like of course like you can give like the the voluntary donations and stuff, but it's not like an economic enterprise to be religious. And I think it's interesting because I think at least today, like hobby is like very closely tied to the aspect of money, like apart from anything else, because like you can, but it's weird, right? Because religion is not a hobby, but you could say like going to the scouts is a kind of hobby, right? So I'm so you see it's weird where we draw the line and say like, okay, like this is a hobby, but this is not. And but and so hobby could have like these bad connotations, as we said, that like you cannot gain money from it, so you get reduced to the category and definition of hobby. But at the same time, hobby has these liberating qualities that like you do something because you love it, right? You don't even want to get paid. You don't care about that type of interaction, right? It's liberating because there's so much passion in it. Or for example, in the case of like, let's say like going to scouts, like that is a hobby. It's a hobby that can better yourself, like your relations, your abilities, right? It's not like collecting phone calls or trains or something, and it's still, you could still call it a hobby, but it's still better yourself. So I think like almost, and also like, for example, you could be like a professional athlete, and that just means that you get paid. It doesn't even mean that you have to be like good at it. It's just like that you get paid. You can be like an amateur and be one of the best boxers or soccer players of the world, but the difference between amateur and pro is just if you get paid, and the difference between hobby and job is if you get paid. Like regardless of any other consideration, if it's good for you or if it's not. And of course, as with anything, you can have like a hobby that's like constructive for you, and you can have like one that's maybe detrimental for yourself. But I think that's the one of the thoughts I was having, that almost like the clearest definition I have to say like, oh, this is a hobby or this is a job, is that you get paid, and all the others are just like reflections on like the types of hobbies that you can have. But I think that's like the most clear distinction. But yeah, those were just some thoughts.
Delightful, Emilio. I'll give it to Javier, Chitan, and then Mr. Barnes. It's very interesting where people like it's a hobby in a bad way until you're paid for it. But of course, if you can't, and therefore it's a waste of time. You're not doing something worth your time. But of course, how do you get to the place where you do the hobby well enough to get paid for it if you can't do it when you're not paid for it? So it becomes like a logic that doesn't permit its own realization. Brandon also made the point that, you know, in Weber, the Protestant work ethic and kind of the structure of capitalism comes out of Christianity. And yet Christianity, for example, cannot be reduced to economics. So there's this interesting thing where the realm of the non-work, or you could say the non-economic or the leisure space, becomes the place where the metaphysical terms are decided upon of which frame work. So then, of course, if you're not allowed to have a leisure space, or there's like an impoverished leisure space for all the reasons we're talking about, then perhaps the metaphysics we subconsciously arise to and then work according to will not be our own, or they won't be optimal, or there could be various problems with it. So not owning a leisure space as irreducible to an exchange logic could actually result in the logic of the exchange being ones that's not optimal, or one we've not thought about, or one that ends up being problematic in various ways. Not that that means capitalism is bad. That's really important. You know, you have to make all these distinctions these days between a free market, pricing market, small capital, blah, blah, blah. You know, we've said before, you have to have a logic of exchange, but it's interesting to think that if you're not allowed to think outside a space of exchange, you might not be able to think about the terms of exchange. But let me give it to Javier, Chitan, and then Mr. Samuel Barnes.
Yeah, this reminds me of a piece that I wrote on about, well, actually, I don't think I wrote it yet. I did a video on it, where really we need to talk about exchange is really for subsistence. That's really it. You do things for each other, for the sake of each other. That's really it. That's really it. But of course, what's problematic is, again, this logic of exchange, and it traps us. It traps us into thinking that when one gives, one needs to return something, and so on. Now, this gets back to Thomas's point on the gift, which I would say, Thomas, I basically agree with you. Like, I don't have like any discrepancies, basically, because Kierkegaard really does a nice exposition on the gift. The gift for Kierkegaard is, we're all lower than the gift. Nobody is higher than the gift, and we're all equal in comparison to the gift. The idea that traps us is this idea of possession, that when I give something, I believe it is mine when I give it. And so Kierkegaard rebuts with, no, you were given, you have this because you were given to it by God, right? So whatever you give is always, in some sense, a gift from God. So you can never say that what you give, you should have, in some sense, a return, because you were already given something. So you cannot claim what you give is yours. This is why I like Kierkegaard's exposition. Now, to go back to Derrida's gift of death, which is a very important topic, because we have to talk about love, because what ends up happening is that we feel like when there's a failed exchange, we go into the logic of sacrifice, right? I'm sacrificing myself. But the thing is, the logic of sacrificing always follows, I'm sacrificing to get something in return. I hope that my sacrifice will lead to something. And like Daniel said before, and I think the last talk, where it's like, you know, maybe we need to think about the idea of sacrificing sacrifice. That when we sacrifice, we also sacrifice sacrifice. Derrida actually does this kind of move in the gift of death, where the moment you sacrifice for something, that love is so great that it basically negates the sacrifice. That from the beginning, it was already going to be negated. But as usual, love demands an offering. And just like the story of Jacob having to attempt to sacrifice his son, it's this idea of I have to give something to understand that I already have it, right? This is why I love the story of Jacob sacrificing his son, right? He has to do something, act like he's willing to give up his only son because now he's finally have a son, and then realize that in this midst of giving, he has him, right? But he has to give. So we have to sacrifice and give in this sense. There's something else I wanted to bring up in this idea. I think, the logic of, you know, because I'm a sociology minor now. I remember I was talking to one of my sociology professors, and I was like, yeah, man, this grind culture sucks. He's like, yes, the good old Protestant ethic. So anyways, that kind of made me laugh, because this kind of reminds me of what Daniel said. There is, you know, like what we said before, we can't reduce to the logic of the economics for Christianity, but it's funny because for Derrida, in the gift of death, he actually says that Christianity represses what Plato did. It's like a double repression, which is very interesting. And it's maybe Daniel can go into it. I don't remember it too much, so I don't want to put the pressure on you, Daniel. But there is something about this Platonic idea then that gets repressed, and then Christianity comes in, represses it again, and it's very interesting. But anyways, I'll leave it there.
Magnificent. I'll give it to Chetan, Mr. Barnes, and then Brandon. And Brandon made a very good point in the comments on where modern life is defined, arguably in certain parts in the West, by a spread of leisure. So now there's the question of why is it that we have more leisure than ever before? Is there almost seemingly more collection? Is it well, that might speak to where more leisure without culture or social capital to train people in how to use that leisure becomes very problematic. Leisure does not teach you how to use it in of itself. So then you would need philosophy, theology, culture, all these different things. So I think it's a very good point Brandon made. And don't worry, you can always talk about aliens. No matter what you want to say, just bring up aliens, will be fine. But Chetan, good to see you today, my friend.
Hi, yeah, I'm sorry I was driving at that time. I just logged in to just listen to you all. Yeah. There's something fascinating that about aliens. I'll start from there. You know, there's a list of topics. I think the aliens, we have the hobby, we have the gift, and we have the exchange. I think these are 4 themes that are running across our discussion table in that sense. There's something fascinating about aliens. One, aliens can be conceptualized when we have this idea of the earth as a whole, you know, as a coherent whole in that sense, which is why if you think about God, it is we can retroactively think of God as something alien to us in that sense, and God does coincide with alien to the extent that they both sort of arrow towards something on the outside in that manner. But alien specifically emerges at a point when we have exhausted the world that we have, when the world itself doesn't have an outside in that sense. And if we think about aliens in a very this question of the world and what is at stake in thinking of the outside of the world, aliens actually lie at the very interesting intersection of what Deleuze would call the good sense and the common sense. In that sense, that Deleuze that aliens encodes within itself a fantasy of the outside. And a lot of times, if you think about arguments that we give to support that there is alien life, and I'm not against aliens, don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-alien or anything like that. I'm just saying that a lot of times the logics we give to support alien life in that sense are logics which come from certain kind of common sense. What I mean by it is these are logics of the kind that, what kind of probability we would have that there's no other life anywhere in the world, given the fact that life evolved on Earth. Or or we have only sort of explored very small percentage of the universe, and the probability of there being life in other parts of the world is very, very high. Like, I remember this guy, this famous person who sort of talks physics. I can't remember the name of the person right now, who gave this logic that we have only explored, if the universe is an ocean, we've only sort of seen one drop of that ocean. Through our all technology and everything. And those kind of logics, which sort of coincide with this commonsensical thinking, that form of commonsensical thinking is a thinking which doesn't sort of engage with the negativity of the object itself, of the process itself. It's a thinking which sort of has a linear cause and effect relationship, which doesn't think about the gap within that. Good sense is a form of sense you use when you have to think through the gap. You should think through the contradiction, think through the failure in the thinking process itself. And if you look at these kind of arguments, these are very commonsensical arguments. These are arguments which are based upon which very clearly come from a certain fantasy that the life on Earth would become meaningless if there's nothing outside left. It's something of that stake that exists in our thinking on alien. And I think given a few centuries or maybe a couple of few decades, we would reach a point when there will be something much more bigger at stake in how we orient ourselves towards alien life. Whether we find it or not is a different issue altogether. Because if there is no outside left, and I'm not saying there is no, I'm just saying if we are able to convince ourselves to the extreme that there is no outside, it would substantially change the way we orient our desires. It would substantially change the way humans condition their lives on Earth. And there is something at stake in that regard, because I think long time back we lost God as an outside entity, God, angels, and those kinds of things. Modern life was very safely able to encounter God in a manner that it didn't need to be an radical outside, which sort of thrusts itself upon our lives. Something radically shifted there. I want to say things upon the gift and superego question that I think Jochen has raised. It's a brilliant question, and the hobby one, but I think I'll come back on it later. Yeah. Thanks.
Excellent, Chetan. I'll give it to Mr. Barnes, then Brandon and Emilio. And don't forget eschatological excretion. That also came up in the conversation. So this is the golden corral, all you can eat, that conversation. So, it's really great. I really like what you just said about the concept of the alien requiring kind of a totalization of the earth to think outside of it. There's also something about the moment you call something a hobby, it's almost like you've totalized all meaningful work and you're saying that's outside of it. By meaningful, I mean according to valuable. Now, by according to the system. So there's some kind of totalizing, you say, oh, that's just a hobby. But that's not how they used to say it, right? A hobby was like, if you didn't do a hobby, it's like, yeah. Well, Brandon made a great distinction in the chat between idle and bored, right? And there's a book on Patricia Sachs. He did a literary analysis of the concept of boredom, and it really doesn't appear for till 200 years ago. Like, it's a newer, more modern idea, right? Where you just are bored. And there's something where the hobby, if it was a skill and not collecting, was the embetterment. And if you didn't do it, you almost couldn't be a good member of the society or a good citizen or a good person of the culture. So there's some concepts there. I like that distinction. And I will give it to Mr. Barnes. Mr. Barnes, what would you like from the Golden Corral?
Nah, can't beat an all you can eat.
No, all you can eat, man, except with the poop.
Something. Yeah, first part's more of an observation. The kind of talk of the Protestant work ethic, I find, it's just something that's occurred to me recently. I mean, it's more of an observation because I don't really have skin in the game here, and I, you know, as much as I love people dunking on prots, I think they've become a bit of a scapegoat.
The Protestants?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Let me explain. So things I've observed is like, you know, the Protestant work ethic. Oh, now they're responsible for the ills of capitalism. Another thing I've noticed is that people have called wokeism, the anti-woke crowd have called wokeism like a perverse denomination of Protestantism. I think that's a point. And then sort of the third thing I've noticed is people are also calling the AI and the praise of AI is another like perverse like offshoot of Protestantism, you know. So it's interesting. I don't know whether there's a reason as to why that intellectual tradition become such a scapegoat. I'd be interested to see what everyone else thinks. For me, it's more of an observation. I don't really know. Oh yeah, another one that was quite strange is that this was on Twitter recently. It was quite viral, so I wouldn't be surprised some of you guys saw it. But people were comparing different cultures' foods. And you know, looking like wonderful pictures of Chinese and Indian food and all this sort of stuff, and then you know a plain ham sandwich is like Protestant food. And one of the arguments in there was that, well, you know, if you just have like a plain ham sandwich, you're able to straight away after lunch, you're able to get back to work, you know. So I don't know if anyone's got anything interesting to add to that. Those are just sort of my observations on that. I do want to. This is kind of rewinding a little bit, but I think what Emilio was saying about the difference between, I don't want to avoid using the word hobby, things you do for the sake of it and your job or like career, just to give kind of like a personal reflection on that. You know, when you tell people that, oh, I'm an author, or I'm writing, or I'm doing stuff on YouTube, people often ask like, oh, would you like that to be like your full-time thing? Would you like that to be your job? And it's quite interesting because I definitely am in the camp where, you know, it'd be nice to get more people involved in what I'm doing, but ultimately, the shift to making it an economic thing changes the nature of the task, you know, because all of a sudden you're not doing it for the sake of it. You're not, you know, like some of the stuff I write is pretty obscure. Some of the obscure writers, you know, it's not like I'm not aiming to get like the maximal audience I can. I haven't got like a Patreon and I'm trying to get as many people on the Patreon as I can. You know, as soon as it made, like, I really don't want it to become that, because as soon as it makes that shift, then, you know, I'm regurgitating Wikipedia articles for video essays on YouTube, or I'm, you know, like writing on the thing that is the most popular that week. And it's, you know, that is a job. That's not a calling. That's not something that you're sort of compelled to do. So that's kind of what I think about the difference there.
No, that's excellent. I'll give it to Brandon, then Emilio. It definitely seems that it requires quite a lot of conditioning of character to be able to make money on something and it not lose something in that gain of the money.
Well, I mean, yeah, and you know, writing is one thing, but philosophy especially, the incentives of economics are going to change the way you think, because we're humans and we're weak. And we post hoc rationalize things. We're like, oh yeah, I wrote about AI and crypto because it was like, you know, what I was really intellectually driven to do, you know, not because it's flavor of the week. So I'm quite happy, you know, sticking to.
I mean, you're pointing out a lot of things. I mean, I think it is. Well, a few things I will know, and then I'll give it to Brandon. There is something about a scapegoating of Protestantism. Jordan B. Cooper has a lovely channel where he talks about that. There's also Stephen Nemes, Nemes, where he's someone who's very interested in Catholicism, but got, you know, was thinking about the different authority, different structures of authority. And I think there actually needs to be a constructive conversation between, you know, there's a lot of East Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and Protestantism that is not just speaking to straw men. I think that would be really productive. You know, even like, you know, well, I think what can happen is like if you're under the pressure of making a video all the time, And you don't even know, for example, that there are a lot of scholars that question the narrative that Protestantism gave you modernism, right? You actually think that's really academically sound because you read about it and you did all these, so you make a video about it. And just because of the pressures of putting a new video, and then it turns out like that's not really the most up-to-date way of thinking. So I think when money gets involved, I do think it becomes hard to be up-to-date, or to actually, just to say, I think it's hard to keep reading as much as you need to read, frankly. Like once it becomes a job, I think reading gets sacrificed first, and I think there's cost to that. But both of those are very interesting points. And it does make me think that in the book Listening Hearts with Mr. Conyers, he says the difference between the alienated person and the fully human person is doing work that is part of your home. Like the fully human, their work is tied to their home. The person that is alienated is doing work for something that doesn't feel like their home. So it alienates them. And there is something that once you start making money off of your passion, it stops being yours and it starts being the consumer's. And gradually, the thing that made you fully human becomes a thing that alienates you. So there might be something with Mr. Conyers' work, but let me pass it to Mr. Brandon. Mr. Brandon, it is a pleasure to see you today, sir. I hope you are doing well.
Good to see you too, Dan. Hi, everyone. This is the first time I've ever done this. Yeah, by the way, what is the eschatological excretion referring to?
He went straight for the money. Yeah, we had a conversation where aliens, like, we have this like constipation where we want the world to end, or we want some like big event to confirm everything. And aliens is like, that's what we could provide us, that eschatological excretion where we get out of our constipation. But if it actually occurred, it would force us to change. So we don't really want it, but we want it to be close enough. So we have this kind of ironic distancing as we were talking about hobbies. But yeah, that was one of the
Are you also playing with the fact that eschatological and scatological are so similar?
Oh, that was good. That was good, Brandon. Nice.
No, I'm saying this has got to be the title. I know you need to it's got to be the. I know. I'm surprised. No, I'm thankful someone brought it up.
Nice, Brandon.
Exactly the same thing. The alliteration play is just too good.
We might get a new audience that we don't want, though.
Like I think I'm gonna find salvation in that. Yeah. Like, oh, that crowd. Well done, Brandon. No, we had not brought that up.
Those two words they're shockingly similar. And people who are native Spanish speakers often have trouble saying the S without preceding it with an E, I'm trying to think of a good example. Nothing comes to mind, but basically, I think a lot of native Spanish speakers would pronounce scatological. So it's just even more. Anyway, yeah. I mean, I was going to mention, or I was going to really just ask you guys something about sacrifice, but that was like now 20 minutes ago. So I just thought I would say something in response to. I don't know if Weber is correct. That's just a perspective that I had to teach to a class once, because we were talking about the origins of economic development, really, industrialization. And so we talked about Weber's argument, a kind of cartoon version of it, that as I remember it, that argument depicts the Calvinists fairly positively. I mean, it is noble things about them that lead them in the direction of capitalism, like the propensity not to be ostentatious and obviously to be good stewards of their property, and to save and to be responsible, frugal, prudent, etc. So I don't know. In that account, they come off pretty well. And yeah, it would be pretty perverse to get mad at Calvinism or Protestantism because 2023 hyper-capitalism has all of these negative attributes. I mean, that's like a pretty strained argument. But yeah, I mean, you were also saying that people have described wokeism as a variant of Protestantism, and I have done that. I mean, I think that wokeness is indisputably a kind of quasi-religion. There are some respects in which it's not like a religion. I think for many of its adherents, it doesn't involve any kind of sacrifice, to return to that concept we were talking about. But there are a lot of resonances between the Protestant or Calvinist notion of original sin and certain aspects of wokeism, I think. And obviously, there's a kind of fundamentalist, illiberal, authoritarian strain, but that's not remotely specific to Puritanism. I mean, that's just people and the way that ideas capture them. So anyway, those are just some random reflections on the relationship between wokeism and Protestantism. And I mean, I do think it's probably some kind of godless, heretical vestige of Protestant Christianity. But I'm not sure I could defend that claim at length. I mean, the last thing I'll mention, this is something I've been thinking about lately. Again, it relates to wokeism, is I do think that the most fundamental cause of this set of ideas that, for lack of a better term, we might call wokeism is the propensity in Northwestern European societies for guilt. And its settler colonies like the United States. And just a couple of things about this, you know, the pagan Germanic tribes, you know, the Alemanni, the Vikings, the Franks, those were not guilt cultures. So clearly Christianity played a decisive role in the development of guilt culture. But what's interesting to me is that Slavic Christendom and Southern European Latin Christendom don't have the same guilt cultures. Like, the Spanish and the Portuguese aren't as guilty about what they did in Latin America. You know, the Slavs don't feel as guilty about the various things they've done. Everyone has done horrible things. And going outside of the Christian world, you know, the Turks don't feel as guilty about the Armenian genocide. The Hutus don't feel as guilty about the brutal and very recent genocide of the Tutsis. So I think there's something about Northwestern Europe that is very guilty, you know, and I would include America in that, because we are, you know, we're an English-speaking, Anglo-descended country, Germanic, I'm from Northern Europe, and now I don't know what the origins of that guilt culture are, but, and I could be wrong about this, but I really do think that is at the root of this ideology that has captured our institutions. And of course, Protestantism would be one kind of clean explanation of Northwestern European guilt-related exceptionalism, because Protestantism is, you know, pretty specific to Northwestern Europe and its settler colonies. But what I don't understand is why Protestantism would give rise to more guilt than Catholicism, because guilt is a very important part of Catholicism too. I'm less familiar with Orthodox Christianity, but anyway, those are just some kind of random thoughts.
Lovely.
In response to what Barnes said.
Yeah, lovely, Brandon. I appreciate that very much. And first off, if you ever want to respond to something 20 minutes ago, we respond to stuff 2 hours ago all the time. No issue at all. So worry not. And it is like, I think Hannah Arendt made the point that the idea of humility as a virtue was unimaginable to like Greek and classic societies. And then after Christianity, like humility as a virtue. So there definitely seems to be something about certain vices, virtues, et cetera, so forth, that are culturally or sociologically conditioned. And then the questions become why. And it also, like, if we believe that humility is a virtue, like it literally is a virtue, like if you actually believe that, then must you have a metaphysical system that also, say, brings guilt with it? And then what are the virtues of guilt? Is guilt always bad? You know, when are the times it's good? Is it when guilt is weaponized that it becomes a problem? When it's when only the scapegoat is guilty per se? There are all those questions that emerge. And I definitely think that it is very important to realize that when people talked about the Protestant work ethic, it was a good thing. It was like, oh, this is a good thing. And that now we project upon that something bad when there's, you know, I don't know, hundreds of years of other explanations for why things could have gone the way they went. But it's interesting how, well, it goes to show how desperate we are to find a cause that's the head of a Wikipedia article. Like, to try to explain the modern world without like a nice little title phrase like Protestant work ethic is really hard, and we're required to read small print books. And I really like just saying something that everyone recognizes, because that's the skeleton key that gives me social acceptance. But anyway, let me give it to, is wonderful, Brandon. Let me give it to Emilio, Javier, T-Town, and then Mr. Fishman.
it was some really interesting points. The thing about religion, because I think like I think there could be an interesting distinction between like being Catholic and being Christian, because like it's like of course like the doctrines are similar, but for example, like here in Mexico, like in Mexico, we are like in theory like the official religion is like the Catholic religion, and of course like oh in theory like if you go and ask someone, they will say they are Catholic. Like if you get like a random person on the street, they will say like Catholic. They may have like I don't know, like a little picture of like the Virgencita or something, but it's weird because most of them are just like Catholic on paper. Like they go through baptism, first communion, but they don't go to church. They don't really even like think about religion or God and their values. Like they are like basically Catholic on paper, right? And it's been like this is all unofficial. I don't have statistics, but it's been um like in the last few years there's been a huge rise from Catholics to Christians, right? Like for example, I have an uncle that he was like Catholic all his life and he became like Christian, right? And you can see that there are some distinctions in the sense that like they approach them, and mainly, and I think the main thing, for example, I've not been to Spain, but in Spain, if they are mainly Catholic, let's say, like the your relationship with the values and the virtues and guilt and humility are way different than a Christian, because like if you're Catholic, you're Catholic and you have like the Pope and stuff, it's like a standardized thing. And if you're Christian, you have all these different denominations, which I think are really interesting. You can even go to like woke denominations like within Christianity, like they have like churches and stuff. So I think that's really interesting because you can almost fit yourself to the amount of guilt you have or like or well okay so I think that could be like a different way to to look at it, like the Protestants like versus Catholic. That could explain maybe some of the guilt, could be but and for me it's really interesting because like most of our systems today are based on Christianity without even knowing. Like for example, the concept of human rights, like if like it's just the secular version of just like of something given by God, right? Like by definition, like human rights is something like innate to human beings, like that can only be given by God. And then we have like all this political system and government that are supposed to safeguard um these ways of ideologies, and like even our system of legal system to resolve things is based on like justice, and justice is also like I believe a core tenet of this like Christian Catholic religion. So like it paints our whole way of understanding the world, even though if you don't believe, because it's ingrained in our institutions. And I think it's sometimes refreshing to look at other ways of seeing the world, because it's widely different. Because as I said, like in Mexico Catholic, you hear about these values, you more or less understand that the communion, the cross, like you have to repent in another life, you may be saved or not. And so it's like this framework that you go through life. But just the other day I was reading something about related to Buddhism, and I found it really interesting because the very little information I knew about Buddhism was like about like the middle way and all this type of stuff. But it was quite interesting because the things I read, it's the first time I'm reading it, so if I will try my best to explain the stuff I could understand. That was like it's charnel ground, and this relates to what Chiton said, that for example there we want there to be an outside, like if we have the world and like aliens are outside, like for example if we have our main job and the hobby is the outside, we always want an outside we can escape to, because inside sometimes gets unbearable. Like so we please, for the love of God, let's be something out there that it's not this, because it's like you cannot bear it at times. And charnel ground is this idea of like of Tantra Buddhism. I think I'm not. This is the first time I'm encountering this concept. That this was is like this is the only thing that exists. Like if you get like a rebirth, there are like hells, but they're but just are just like angry all the time. And if you go to heaven, you go to like a placid like state of like being pleasant and you don't do anything. So like actually like this specific plane of reality Earth is like the best one, and it's charnel ground that it's like horrible and brutal, and you can like there are one of the exercises was to go to like a pit of bodies that they didn't bury them, just left them out in the open, and just to see that as something that to view life not as it's a strange dance between nihilism and eternalism. Eternalism being the same, that like life has a definite purpose, meaning, etc., and nihilism like nothing matters. It was this weird dance that you could see life in a specific or in a more accurate way, and you could see that it's both the most horrible thing ever and like one of the most beautiful things at the same time. So yeah, and that conception that if it redirects our thought, because if you view as nothing is ever outside, because even in religion, when there's an outside in the sense that out of pain, right, you go to heaven, or out of this reality and you go to eternal suffering, there's always an outside. But if you think like you are always going to be existing no matter what, you get no rest at all in that sense, you will always exist. That is a frightening proposition. And then but it rearranges the way we interact with all these concepts, and just like bringing it down to like a more economic type of situation, like what, like going back to hobbies, like as Samuel said, that you have a hobby and you have and it changes your relation when you interact with the economic activities. But I would propose that when you interact, if I have a product, right, and I want to sell it, I have to interact in specific ways with reality and with people. I cannot say like this piece of art is beautiful, you might as well buy it. Like it doesn't work like that. It has to appeal in some way to the customer, right? So I think like when you interact in not capitalism per se, just like in an economic exchange, you of course have specific limitations that rise to your creative act. And those are like satanized like nowadays, but I think they can be, they're just constraints, right? So if you work within them, you can produce some really amazing things. And just it's hard, it's way harder, because I'm just going to pull like two examples to conclude my participation. Like you have these two YouTubers. One is called Dyck. I'm not pronouncing his name correct. He's like an economic YouTuber, and I started watching his videos, and they were really cool because he had a background on magic and like show business. He made like the very entertaining videos. He actually gave information that was like relevant to financial stuff, and it was nice. But then again, you need to produce videos so the algorithm keeps recommending them, and then slowly and surely he, at least to my perception, he became a shadow of himself. He just became something that like recited Wikipedia articles that just like explored, like he just said words so he could have a video and could monetize that. So he completely went off the rails from his original act of like creating something beautiful and useful. You have so that's the danger you go through when you monetize a hobby, when you take this passion and you apply these constraints that, if not managed correctly, can completely destroy your project, right? But you have the other side, and it's quite unorthodox and it's not common, but there's a guy called Joseph Anderson that he makes game reviews, like something really niche game reviews, and he makes like in-depth game reviews, like 3 hour, 4 hour, 5 hour game reviews of a specific game. And I really enjoy them. They are marvelous. But he takes them like 1 year to make each one, but he still has to eat like in that year, right? So he has a Patreon, and people actually know that he's going to take a year, and they pay him so he can take the whole year to analyze the game and produce a 4 hour video. So it's not that common, and it's way harder to do that because you have to go a little bit against some of the most easy rules of the system. But you can find ways to monetize your hobby or passion that I think actually enhance it instead of destroy it. But it's quite tricky, and you have to be really intentional about it. But just those were some thoughts that said, because just to conclude this analogy, because when you do something by yourself, it's almost like it's for yourself, by yourself. But for example, when you dance with someone, the dance is not yours, right? It's yours and the other person, right? And it's a beautiful dance. So if you engage a customer into your creation act, it's not, I don't think it's not a submission, it's a dance. You have to dance with another person, but I think that's could be equally beautiful, I think. But yeah, that's it.
That was beautiful. And if any of you want to give me money so I can do a year playing Chrono Trigger on the Super Nintendo and do a game analysis, I am more than happy to do that. You just let me know. And I was hoping you were going to mention a YouTube channel called Escatactical with the S in parentheses, like Brandon brought up. Best channel ever. There's a few things that come to mind. Also, now I'm thinking about where, say, maybe the West has collected ethics, but we don't say believe in a God that would then compel us to be changed by those ethics. So it's like the difference between like you're left with the collection of the ethics from, say, Christianity in the West, but you don't believe in a God that would then make the collection like a hobby or something you need to internalize as a skill, right? So it's like really bad, because then what ends up happening is you have the ethics and the morals, but then it's just what other people fail to live up to, as opposed to you living up to, because you don't have that God to force you to internalize it. So then you get these kind of very weird appeals to humility by rich and powerful politicians that use humility to keep you from trying to win the election from them or something, right? Like, I'm always very interested on the difficulty of the problem of forgiveness today, because like, what does it mean to forgive if you don't believe in God? Like, you know, it's good, but then if you forgive, you're enabling evil. So you only forgive people that think like you, but is that really forgiveness? I think that's really a major problem that we're going on. I'm going to give it to Javier, Titon, Mr. Fishman, and then Mr. Barnes. I also wanted to note there's something about frontier here Brandon brought up in the comments that's very interesting. There is a kind of frontier when you collect, because you're yet to get that 1972 Thomas the Tank Engine and you're off to cross that frontier. But this is not a frontier that changes your horizon of experiencing the world or how you carry yourself as a subject. And there seems to be a difference between the frontier of being a better boxer. So the difference between the frontier of, say, collecting Thomas the Tank Engine. Mr. Barnes loves Thomas the Tank Engine, but I love Chrono Trigger. Yeah, man. So collecting that, and then the frontier of a skill seems to be different. And then it's also quite interesting to think of the difference between collecting alien sightings and then taking seriously that aliens exist. Like, if you really truly believed alien exists, then the concept of human rights would have to change, right? Like, it would maybe have to be like, okay, well, is it okay to kill aliens, right? Would you have to expand it? So we really, in a sense, are only at the level of collecting alien sightings, not actually truly believing in aliens, because that might change our entire paradigm. But of course, you know, why would you change your paradigm yet if you don't know they exist, right? Well, so that you could be ready in case they really do exist. So it's not so pathological, but then it could be a waste of time. So it's interesting that one might have to make an absolute choice or risk. Mr. Javier Rivera, go on ahead, my friend.
There's so much to bring up in here, but I took notes. So Brandon said something really interesting about the comparison between the cultures, North and so on. Something that I learned in my rap, God and religion class is that actually every other culture except the kind of northern region had a problem with syncretism. The other cultures had no problem with syncretism. There's actually a version of Catholic in Latin America that is like sangria, I think that's what it was called. That has no problem with syncretism, right? Other cultures have no problem with syncretism. It was the Western, in Cuba, yeah, that's right. It was the Westerners that had problem with syncretism. They wanted a pure form as such. But you know, what's interesting about the Christian logic on guilt is that everyone is guilty. So this is where we get into an interesting perverse nature of this guilt. Because what ends up happening is that from the logic of Christianity, everyone is guilty. And I think all Christian denominations kind of agree on this logic that everyone is guilty, the original sin. All of a sudden, the multiplicity of denominations that occur ends up doing this double logic of guilt, where it's actually you're guilty because you are not staying true to the original. You could say you are guilty because you're not staying true to the original guilt, right? You're doing some deviation. But now that we're in a sort of era of death of God as such, there is no logic of everyone is guilty anymore. there is just someone is guilty. Someone is guilty as such. So we've completely annihilated the idea. If we want to still say that Christianity, that that the West is still predicated on Christianity, well, we've forgotten the principle of the fact that everybody's guilty. We've forgotten this pivotal point. So that means that we are having guilting others without realizing that we are also guilty. And so this is why I kind of like the other ethnographic locations of Christianity, because they're okay with syncretism, because it seems like guilt implies an outside. Somebody is guilty. Someone should be guilted. So that's my kind of brief comments on that. The other thing, and I feel like there's so many topological layers to guilt right here to kind of dissect. One thing that Kierkegaard reminds me is one, that we did not pick Christianity. This goes back to the absolute choice. I think what's happening is, even though you could say, I don't want to do a broad stroke here, but I'm going to do a broad stroke. Let's say we all kind of got born into Christianity, but none of us chose it, right? So by virtue, Christianity becomes guilty for this raising, right? Us being born into it, right? So there is so many topological layers of guilt going on that, one, we didn't get to pick Christianity. And this is Kierkegaard's challenge, that you have to pick Christianity. You can't just be born into it. Not only that, there's the West notion of being against syncretism, which is the fact that, you can't have this outside as such. And then there's also the forgetting of the fact that we're all guilty, into which somebody must be guilty for this. Now, I want to capitalize more on this notion of outside that Chetan brings up, because I think passion is a perfect example of why we think there's an outside. Is that passion itself prevents reduction by virtue, right? But passion also says that you must choose the thing that you are passionate for. But we all know that the reasons that we give for such passions do not entirely capture the reasons why we do such things. So the very passions that we have for earth as such gets essentially the excretion basically manifests as an outside. The passion for earth, the passion for being, gets this notion of outside. So what we end up encountering is our own perverse nature of passion, to which we must say there is an outside, to which we must say there is aliens, to which we must say there is something out there, because our reduction of earth as whole as we know it is so symptomatic that our own passion is trying to prevent us from this happening, right? So this presents itself as, quote, outside, that there is an outside. And I think this is the danger, and I think this is the thing that Chetan was kind of pointing at, is that if we don't really grapple with this idea that we don't like the possibility of thinking there is no outside. But I would say it's because passion prevents us from reducing the very thing that we know as such. And so in some sense, there always has to be an outside, but it's not an outside that should be like so traumatic to us. It's the fact that passion prevents us from reducing the thing that we know. So in some sense, there has to be an outside, but there is no outside, but there has to be an outside. And I know that's confusing, but it has to sort of drive us to not reduce once again the earth as it is. Let me see what else. Oh, forgiveness. This is a great. If you guys ever get to watch Derrida's speech on forgiveness on YouTube, it's really quick. Look it up. He got a lot of heat for this. He gave a speech on forgiveness, talking about how real forgiveness is for the unforgivable. And nobody liked this. Not a single person liked what Derrida said about this, because Derrida says pure forgiveness is without calculation. You should have no reason to forgive. That's why you forgive the unforgivable. And so this is where the topic of exchange and forgiveness become intricately linked, because we're always calculating why and how I should forgive, right? I should forgive to maintain these relations. I should forgive because he did something in return. I should forgive, so on and so on. Derrida is going to say that's not forgiveness. That's not true forgiveness. True forgiveness is without calculation. Now, he isn't against calculation, but he's just saying that's just not true forgiveness. And that's it. That's all I got to say.
Nice, Javier. Thanks for bringing up that Derrida video and that everyone disliked. There was a few things. I'll give it to Cheeton, Mr. Fishman, and Mr. Barnes. I'm now realizing that hobby is really close to the word hobo. So maybe if you have a hobby, they go, oh, and that means you're a hobo and you don't have a job. So maybe there's a subconscious thing that's made us all be against hobbies because we don't want to be hobos. Not sure. Hobos are pretty cool. Actually, I had a family member that was a true hobo, which means you jump trains, went across the country. It was really cool. So that was neat. A few more things. I'm wondering if there's a difference between guilt and guilty. Maybe there's something about guilty that means there's a law you like, and guilt is like something you carry along. That's interesting. And there is also this kind of idea that everyone, if you're born in America or the West, you're kind of born forced to inherit Christianity. And you didn't ask for that, but so it's kind of like that's kind of interesting. I was going to say a few things on that. I now wonder, though, if there's something about, say, you know, when Achilles wants to, he always has to kind of honor the cosmos order. Like there's a certain order when Achilles is allowed to attack, and like the whole thread of his rage is like Zeus talks like Achilles can get mad enough to defy the cosmic order and they'll rip across the cosmos. So there's like Achilles has to be ordered, and he has to be ordered basically with the pre-existing myth, you know, logic, theological logic of the day. Well, there's something about like Jesus that shows up and it's like, hey, a given person that's actually counter to the pre-existing logic can speak on behalf of the cosmos, and everyone will kind of reject him, but he's still like objectively right. And I wonder if that, which there's a lot of danger to that, and yet there's a lot of potential resurrection from that, because then in perhaps wokeism kind of has that. It's like, yeah, everyone's against us, but we're speaking on behalf of a cosmic order. And even if we're like, people are against us or the institutions are against us, you know, we saw in Jesus doing that, so it could be okay, right? Which then goes to speak that if you're dealing with a mythos like Jesus, it's really important to also have a belief in God, because otherwise it's really almost inevitable that it's going to be not everyone is guilty, but someone is guilty. And if anyone disagrees with us, we're like Jesus being rejected by the social order, so you can't question us. So I'm now wondering if like maybe it's not Protestantism, but just a mixture of a Christian narrative of an individual really not being easily checked and balanced, who can speak on behalf of the cosmic order, that sort of character, plus not belief in God, then it's like really an unleashed thing. I'm wondering if that's something there where at least in Achilles, yeah, Achilles can get really mad and kill you all, but at least he still has to kind of honor some sort of structure. So that there's some thoughts I have there, but let me pass it to Cheeton, Mr. Fishman, and then Mr. Barnes. And we'll probably close at about 3:30. I have some obligations. I've enjoyed this very much. I really want to talk about aliens one more time. We're going to try to fit it in there. So Cheeton.
Thanks. I'll not talk about aliens now. I will. I'll probably. Brandon said something which sort of interested me. This thinking about Christianity in that sense, and when we're discussing this question of other, outside of the worldly, there's something about that thing that which. And I'm no expert on Christianity. I'll be sort of frank about it. I'm just sort of talking some things that I've read here and there. But if you look at how Foucault sort of thought about this problem, he said that Christianity had a particular sort of a problem in that sense that other religions had to find salvation in the next life, in the other world, and so on and so forth. Christianity, at least in its Protestant avatar, had to start thinking about salvation in this life itself. There was something fundamentally shifting at that in that zone. Something similar sort of pointed out by Arendt in that sense, that the Christianity was the extremely unique religion in the sense that because it had to organize itself in a very different conditions. For instance, if you look at how religions organized themselves before Christianity, religions had to organize themselves in a space where you had something what you call a political public sphere in that sense. Where you had access to a sphere which had space for what Arendt would call action. In that sense, things that you do in the world, and you do not have premeditated ends and so on and so forth. Christianity had to organize itself at a point in a time where this political public sphere was sort of collapsing. It was withering away, and people were getting isolated and had to find a religious organization within those isolated realms. You think about this idea of love thy neighbor and so on and so forth, comes from this fact that the social realm was becoming more prominent in the public sphere, and the social realm was getting organized not as communities but as individual different units, in that sense, that those developments of individual units sort of had started. It is in this context that something like guilt becomes important for the modern man. And why does it become important? Nietzsche wrote about it. He has a famous essay called Guilt and Bad Conscience in that sense. And he sort of pointed very early that for modern man, to function through guilt is extremely important. And something strange sort of starts happening. And that question of guilt later was interpreted by Freud as superego. Am I right? So if we have to ask that question honestly, why would guilt become important in these conditions? And it becomes important because if you have to function through your impulses of the ego, and those impulses of the ego need to be constrained and controlled by a power, which sort of Foucault called the sovereign power. This movement of the sovereign power, disciplinary power to biopolitical power. And what Foucault sort of called sovereign power, where through sovereign rules you have certain dictums, commandments, whatever you want to call it, and you're not essentially controlled through or function through law as a mechanism, but a society is organized through certain sovereign, commandments, rules in that sense. And now suddenly you have to organize a society which doesn't have that sovereign structure, but has a structure through law now. Structured through those informal constraints which have to be internalized and functioned because you believe in them, because you are free to follow them, isn't it? And it is in that context that something like superego becomes more and more important. And Foucault sort of pointed out very early. Foucault said it very very clearly that modern power functions through its relationship with knowledge, with truth. Because now the truth is not out there; it has to be internalized by me as a certain technical object, as a certain scientific rational object, which I have to, and it is in this context superego becomes extremely important. Because now law doesn't function simply because a sovereign is asking you to do it and you will follow it, whether you believe it or not. Now you have to believe in it. That is how education becomes important, policing becomes, come to the center. Because modern law functions not through a certain distancing from, external violence in that sense. Modern law functions through a certain internalization of the relationship between state and the individual in that. A certain internal relationship has to be forged between the structure of power and structure of the subject in that sense. As Foucault. So it is in this context superego becomes important. Superego as something which has to be thought through. If ego functions on pleasure principle as Freud thought of it, on self-interest and pleasure principle, whatever, however you want to think about it, superego becomes that point of the functioning of ego where ego can let go of its immediate pleasure demands for, of course, later gains. That is how human beings integrate themselves with society. And what is interesting about superego in Freud is, and I'll just stop here, it's going to take too long, but what is interesting about superego in Freud is that with superego in Freud, what happens is that the command or law of the superego becomes a way to satisfy the most basis of our desires of the unconscious. It's not that superego is simply constraining or blocking the unconscious desire. In fact, superego very quickly becomes a structure, a means through which the most basis of the desires of the pervert enjoyment of the unconscious can be realized. It is in this context that guilt becomes the operating word for in a social dynamic. It's not simply a question of us being guilty. It's a question of at what point we have to operate through guilt in a manner such that our most baser relationships to desire, happiness, whatever you want to call it. These are the words that become sort of important in our times, because most baser desires can be realized and can be satisfied through the following of the command of the superego. That's the structure. Through saying that I will follow the law, I can satisfy my most difficult desire, which I cannot follow by breaking the law. And how do we think through guilt in that frame? I think is the
magnificent comment. I'll pass it on to Hyrule and then Mr. Barnes. It's very interesting what you were saying, because there's a very real sense in which there's a kind of freedom in guilt, because that means you as an individual have a standard or an internal compass that is guiding you that you can fail to live up to. Whereas if there's only guilty, ergo law, there's kind of a less freedom. And yet we tend to associate guilt, if I make that on the cuff distinction between guilt and guilty, where guilty is legal, guilt is sort of an internal compass. The existence of guilt would suggest internal mediation, internal operation, of which then there's an enjoyment in being your own denial, right? Like in Lacan, there's an enjoyment in your own denial, which then you enjoy being the kind of entity that can be denied, because that also brings with it the converse of being the kind of being that has an opportunity to overcome that denial. But then, of course, if you totally overcome it, you may get what you want, find out it's not what you want, and get destroyed by the real, right? So there was all these kind of complicated undertakings. I will note also that Philip Reef, Peter Berger, they were very big on the idea that a society without guilt also will lack the resources for a society to have heroes. Because the same kind of resources internally that gives you guilt also gives you the character and the heroic and internal. And they were very concerned about a culture. Basically, they said that a society without guilt cannot have culture. And if it cannot have culture, it can only be organized by law. And at that point, you have something totalitarian. And it's almost like what's strange is, just on the woke one more time, is there's almost a kind of sense in which in wokeism, it's kind of a guilty guilt. Like, it's weird because you don't really believe that people can change. So you don't really believe, like, there's this idea that you're privileged, therefore you're guilty. And yet there's really a sense in which it's difficult for a person to change just because of their status. And and yet you also don't believe in the institutions by which can legally give forth a sort of sense of guilty. So you have this very weird paradox where you are saying that they're like guilty is guilt, like the lines are blurred. And of course, that's an impossibility. And it creates all these kind of strange social dynamics that then emerge. Because if you're going to accuse somebody, there's kind of the responsibility of believing the person can be internally changed, right? But if you're going to accuse and not believe in the possibility of internal change, well, then the only thing can be law, right? Like finding them guilty. But then what if you don't even believe in those institutions? Well, then it's not clear what's going on. And then then I guess ultimately what has to happen is the institutions have to be replaced with the right institutions. Then we get all of those fun games and different things. But now I'm wondering if we could relate to aliens by guilt or only by guilty, because like, what would the culture be that would relate to aliens in accordance with guilt as just opposed to guilty? But Mr. Fishman, it is so great to have you today, sir. I hope you're doing well and your chickens are good.
I'm doing well. The chickens are good. Okay. So I wanted to say something about Christianity and guilt and wokeism, and then I want to say something about exchange. So I think, like, I've been thinking about this question of like, how is Protestantism different from Catholicism, and how does Protestantism give rise to wokeism? And I think that, like, first of all, like, it's just like a really interesting point that wokeism could only exist within a Christian context, right? This is a point that Jonathan Pajot makes all the time, that like, it's hard to imagine the George Floyd protests in the Roman Empire, right? Like, whatever you think of them, whether you support them or you're against them, it's like, in the Roman Empire, that would have been, oh, you mean a low-class citizen is being abused by a Roman soldier? Of course, right? That's what happens. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. Just be glad that you're strong and not weak, right? But Christianity obviously brings forth this whole ethic of love your neighbor and, you know, help the weak and all that, which can then be sort of turned on its head. Like, I think the move that the woke make is they go from saying the rich should take care of the poor to inverting that to saying that the poor are morally justified to take from the rich, right? But you can only do that if you believe that the rich should take care of the poor. But like, why Protestantism, right? And so I think the difference is that in Catholicism, and again, I'm just kind of spitballing here, I don't know that much about either one, but I think that in Catholicism, what a Catholic says to his child is, you're sinful, but luckily you were born into the Catholic institution, which is working towards your salvation. And so all you have to do is participate within the institution that you were born into, and everything will be fine, right? But Protestantism is born out of protest, right? There in the name, right? And so like Protestantism began with the institution that you were born into is corrupt and needs to be overthrown, right? And so like, as soon as you do that, now it's a whole different game, right? And the guilt, like there's this fragmentation of we are guilty, and there's like this whole self-criticism that emerges in there, right? And then it begs the question, okay, so how do we then know that our new Protestant institution is not also corrupt? Which is how you get the endless fragmentation of Protestantism into a million different denominations, right? Because they just keep doing that. It's just the same logic of like, oh, like Martin Luther, I was born into a institution that's corrupt, but I know better because I can talk directly to God, and so I'm going to overthrow that institution, right? And so that's where I see the logic of Protestantism at play in wokeism. Okay, so that's one thing. Then the other thing, I don't know if this is going to relate, maybe. With exchange, like Javier, you said something really interesting like an hour ago, which is that you said that the logic of exchange is born out of scarcity. And I would modify that to say that the logic of exchange is born out of limitation, right? Because to say scarcity implies that like if we only had enough abundance, we wouldn't need the logic of exchange, right? And I'm not saying, I'm not trying to put those words in your mouth, but that's kind of like where my mind goes, right? Where it's like, it seems to me that exchange is necessary. Like, even if you're totally selfless, you just want to give everything to everyone, you don't have everything, and you can't give to everyone. And so you have to you have to prioritize what you're going to give to who. And even if you're not thinking of yourself, it's still like, if you love somebody who is a drug addict and you give them $1,000 out of the kindness of your heart, you might have just condemned them, right? And so you have to, if you want to give a gift, you have to think like, okay, I will give you this $1,000, but in exchange, you have to go to rehab and like get your life together, right? And so I don't think the logic of exchange is going to go away I don't think it's ever going to go away. I think we have to I would maintain that exchange is always going to be there. And so, and again, I don't know if you're saying that, but I don't know. I guess we're trying to close now, but that would be my question for next up.
I mean, if we get back to aliens, I've got 5 more hours, actually. I mean, the real world, again, who cares, right? No, I think all those points are really good. I'm going to give it to Mr. Barnes and then Chetan, and if anyone has final things to say, please. I'm now wondering, I'm really showing my ignorance. In the same way that, like, when Christians were first Christians, they weren't called Christians, they were like the way or whatever. I'm wondering if, like, where did the word Protestant come from? Was that Catholics being like, yeah, they're protesters, those Protestants?
Literally.
Is that really came? I was wondering. Okay, that was a spitballing, and I might have gotten historical accuracy.
You know what's funny? In the Spanish-speaking world, there's no protestante, as far as I know. Like, I think one of you guys was saying earlier, it's Catholics and Cristianos, Christians. So
interesting. Emilio brought it. That's very.
It's a Germanic term only.
That's funny because I'm like I can't imagine Luther going, I got a great idea. I know what we're gonna call this. That's really funny.
I think it was used as a pejorative.
It's a pejorative. That's funny. And then all the Protestants in America go with it. Y'all didn't get the Those were really good points, Hyroot.
Yeah, we are protesting.
Freaking protesting, baby. Hyroot, that was really good. I also think there is something, like, you want exchange, right? Like, if I give Javier a hug, I want to, like, get his friendship for that hug. There's something about, like there's something about the ordering of the logic of exchange, like in what realms should it be predominant versus other realms. You could even talk a little bit about Michael Sandel's What Money Can't Buy. You know, there are certain realms that need to be protected from market. Chetan has mentioned like the realms where you have to maintain kind of a leisure space so that politics has a role, different things. So it's interesting to think of that. But let me pass it to Mr. Samuel Barnes. Samuel Barnes.
I did want to go out on a limb over the guilt question, and I guess we called it guilt culture, right? I think Brandon was correct in saying this is like a Northwestern European phenomenon, and saying, well, you know, generally that's the kind of Protestant area of Europe. Kind of the thing I wanted to raise is that I think we're inclined to think that, both because, you know, us, you know, we're thinking people here, right? Like we think intellectually, so we think people are moved by ideas. I also suspect, I'm not trying to insult anyone here, I think that we all sort of internalize some of the assertions of liberalism, like modern liberalism. And I think that includes the a kind of blank slate theory that people are, you know, going to be defined by their culture and ideas, basically. And I think we lean towards that. What I would say, kind of just to give a different angle on that, again, I don't know if it's right, it's a theory, so there you go. But, you know, we look at Northwest Europe, well, actually, you know, okay, yeah, you've got, you know, there's Protestants dotted around, but, you know, like Protestantism in France was always oppressed. That was always oppressed in France. It's, you know, genocides or sort of the Huguenots. You have the same sort of thing going on in England, depending on who the monarch is, basically, you know, and causing them to run off to North America. But, you know, you have places like Ireland, which definitely has a guilt culture. Like I have a lot of people who are culturally or actually like ethnically Irish, and they definitely have strong feelings of guilt. And, you know, another exception is, you know, places like England aren't strictly Protestant, they're Anglican, they're somewhere in the middle, you know. So I think there's some things that don't fit that theory. And I suspect that ethnos might have something to do with it. And I'm not talking about, you know, the really simplistic way people look at things like ethnos, like, oh, the color of their skin, this sort of thing. I think Northwestern Europeans had a unique set of problems that would have an effect on their, you know, one thing, their culture, but also I think on the way that the things that were propagated, like ethnically speaking. Like Northwestern Europeans, they have not a unique climate, but they have a climate which means that, you know, you have to have a high time preference. You have to prep for things in the future, you know, winter specifically. And, you know, if you don't prep for that thing, you are quite literally killed off. And this is by nature of the fact that Northwestern Europeans were generally speaking, you know, settled people. They would settle in one place and they would, you know, use agriculture and this sort of stuff. And, you know, you would feel incredibly guilty about eating all the berries in summertime because you like are literally condemning your family's death. Right. Compared to other, you know, peoples who lived in similar, like, or even more extreme climates. You know, the peoples of the steppe, yeah, sure, they lived in cold climates, but they were generally they were warrior nomads. They would move around and take things from people. They would migrate to the south in wintertime. And you know, the same thing goes for the indigenous people of North America. They were nomadic. They would move around.
Interesting.
So I suspect that might have something to do with it. Again, it's going out on a bit of a limb, and I don't want to fall into, again, like I said, I don't want to fall into ethnic discussions that are, you know, blankly, like, again, this is getting into the wokeism stuff. But I think, you know, you have to kind of identify and appreciate that, you know, ethnos is a thing, and geography is a thing. And, you know, it might have something to do with it.
I think that's a magnificent comment. And the role of geography, I find that a very interesting comment. Where is there something about, dare I say, agriculture and guilt that go together? Because if there wasn't, everyone would be the freaking grasshopper instead of the ladybug, right? In the old myth. And if everyone's a grasshopper, we all dead. So there's like a guilt to make sure people plant the seeds, water the seeds, do all the stuff. Like, because you don't, like when you plant seeds, they don't automatically grow. You have to tend to them. So you need a kind of guilt to make sure people are tending to them. Whereas if you know, friggin' shoot a deer, it's dead.
And if you're around the Mediterranean and that sort of stuff, you know, you've got olives on the trees all year round.
Sure, and then people eat them. That's very interesting. I'm very interested. I'll give it to Chetan and Javier on the comment on the possible connection. Because I was just going to say in Ireland, they felt the guilt came from chopping down all the bushes where the fairies lived. But I think agriculture might have something more to do with it, or being a settled people. So, but Chetan, Javier, and then if anyone has final things to say, very interesting.
Just quickly sort of want to say something on folk culture. And it's a fascinating thing that we are observing in some sense. And Brandon is right that it has a very clear religious undertone to the extent that it coincides with this, fundamentalism of certain sorts on one side, and a deep belief in its own correctness, its own higher moral ground on the other, which is extremely interesting to sort of observe. The other thing about woke culture that I think we are observing today is that woke culture is sort of standing on the ground that it doesn't want to take any of the background, any of the things that we took for granted, not only law and so on and so forth, but even things like language. It wants to annihilate all of that stuff that humans take for granted in the background for them to function. It wants to assert itself in a manner that it doesn't want any of these things to be taken, that you can take these things, functioning in the background so that you can act in the world in that sense. There's certain things that has to be in the background for human beings to work in the. The other thing is that wokeness has a very interesting claim on equality, and which I think is something which should stump us. Because equality always was a problem or a sphere of politics, historically. In politics, we always need equality. What wokeness wants is it wants to take equality out of politics into other domains, which necessarily are not domains of equality in that sense. Because one can argue it's a symptom because it doesn't have any political sphere left to assert itself. So it has to assert through, that kind of an argument can be made. But it genuinely wants to take equality out of politics, and it wants to depoliticize equality to the extent that equality becomes, a way through which you can assert yourself in very, very radically, whether it's labor, whether it's work, whichever way you want to think about it. And I think the third thing about the wokeness thing is that wokeness actually is emerging at a scale and in a time at which point religion actually as an organizing principle isn't as strong as one would think about it to be. Religion actually is losing some of its steam and power, and it's at that moment that wokeness is sort of gaining its ground. How do we think through that kind of a convergence which we are seeing? I think it's a question which we all can. I think Jack wrote this wonderful article that wokeness is here to stay. It's not going to go anywhere, and it's in India also. So it's not only in the Christian domain. I think it's intimately linked to nation state and law today. Anywhere nation states as an entity is expanding in its domain, I think wokeness is going to find a very healthy ground with it.
That's a lovely comment, Chetan. I like this idea of moving equality into other areas of life. And Brandon, there is a distinction between equality and equity that is sometimes lost. That I think is very interesting. But let me give it to Mr. Javier Rivera, and then if anyone has closing remarks.
Just to quickly say something, this distinction between equality and equity sort of emerges from certain background of rules. When you have certain background rules, you can have the distinction. But the distinction collapses when the background of rules are not there at all. When you can't take for language and other things for granted.
There's Chetan, you wrote something on Facebook the other day and it has not left my mind. You talked about this idea of the theological stain in philosophy. But you can see the theological stain is like, if we don't acknowledge the theological stain, it becomes the very symptom that perpetuates our own self-negative relations with each other. Because in some sense, our idea of getting rid of the theological stain is exactly what perpetuates the symptom. Like, but anyways, I wanted to address Fishman's comments real quick. Actually, Fishman, so I don't disagree with you on this idea of exchange. I actually say, yes, I agree with you. Exchange is inevitable. My main point is this idea, and I'll kind of use an example in anthropology, is this idea of subsistence economies. This is like hunter-gatherer, right? What's funny about hunter-gatherer is that they are mainly for subsistence, that you hunt and gather for the survival of your own group, right? You can't try to gain anything more than that, because anything more than that is not guaranteed, right? It's not guaranteed that you will find food that day. It's not guaranteed that the crops will survive through the seasons. So one has to hunt because it's not guaranteed that the crops will survive. But you have to plant because it's not guaranteed that the hunters will find something to eat. So everything is done for the sake of subsistence. And this is where the logic of exchange kind of occurs naturally. Like, you have to do it for subsistence. So what I'm saying is that for some reason, in the logic of exchange, we've forgotten subsistence. That when I do something for the other, it's not that it's guaranteed that I will get something in return. I am doing it because it might not be guaranteed. But I am doing it because it is what exactly subsists between you and I, right? But that's the thing. Everybody is concerned about the failure of the exchange. But it's precisely the fact that we pursue this despite of the possibility of its failure that sustains us. That I continue doing what I'm doing because there is no guarantee. And that's what I mean by we exchange for subsistence. That when it's in a relationship of two, you are subsisting for two. And you're not concerning about whether the other guarantees you or and so on and vice versa. It's mainly for the subsistence. And so I think we've forgotten this completely, because once we left that logic of subsistence economies and we started dealing with excess, where it was like, hey, now I can just give you money. Like nothing now. It's like, now it's like, what do I do with my money? So there is something interesting there with subsistence economies, logic of exchange, kind of following the ethnographic history and so on, and seeing where we went wrong, and then religion also. So that there's definitely a lot there.
I like that very much, Javier. Thank you. And there's this interesting theme here at the end on the idea of the consequences of the loss of background. Like, if there's no background, it becomes difficult to tell the difference between equality and equity. It becomes difficult to organize society. Also, the idea that the background of agriculture may have an influence on, say, the arrival of a notion of guilt, et cetera, so forth. So there's something like background that seems in its influence inescapable. And the more you look at that, the more you see that human beings seem to need background.
And I suspect that true meaning is to lean into what we truly are, like to lean into our background, as opposed to like arbitrary, I think quite arbitrary, like intellectual categories we project onto ourselves.
Oh, sure. And then, as you know, for Hume, if you do that, you eat yourself, basically. If you make that mistake of
I would put forward the humane point, yes.
Yeah, I would
Return
too.
to common life.
Yeah, common life, baby. Counter-enlightenment. Now, so this is what I'm wondering now. So the evidence seems to suggest the need to lend into the background, right? If we just grant me that general phrase. What if the role of aliens in ideology is to justify not accepting background? Because if one day aliens are just going to show up and destroy our background, then there's actually like a wisdom in not owning background, because aliens will just destroy it all. So aliens then have the idea of aliens ideologically has two functions. One, science and technology is the road to paradise. And two, not having a background for anything is wise, because if we just make a background on what's the human being and make our ethical, social, economic system relative to that, aliens will show up one day and screw everything up. So then there's a kind of ideological justification with the existence of aliens of not leaning into background.
Maybe we don't even need the existence of like physical aliens, because, once you project something arbitrary and, untrue to your essence, then you're living in like an alien background anyway.
Well, I'm not going to bring in, we did not mention Hegel once in this net conversation. Wow, guys, that, we got poop, Golden Corral, and aliens.
No Nietzsche as well.
No Nietzsche, because we did the comment on Jesus was the only Christian. That was Nietzsche, so I put that in the comments, but not verbally. In Hegel, nature and notion are linked together. And so the notion of aliens has a practical consequence on human beings, even if they don't exist. That has practical consequences, right? And it's interesting to think the role of aliens in ideology, one, to make it seem like technology and science is the way to utopia, and two, the wisdom of not having background. Because if you do, just aliens might show up and destroy it all. And perhaps the difference is in the past, if we use the language of event, which I'll do for Mr. Javier Rivera, if Jesus, like if we use Christianity eschatology, if God shows up, it's kind of the event through the socioeconomic order, like everything will change, will be fused with a new transcendence. But aliens is an eschatology that you then have to live with, right? So like the event of a God showing up is, you could still have a background of what is the human being, because the God that showed up would align with that background, because he created everything. Whereas with an alien, they probably won't align with that background. So the character of the event in the ideology is quite different between God and aliens, even if aliens are scratching the need for something transcendent. As an event, it functions ideologically to justify not leaning into background, and instead of leaning into common life, existing in this sociologically insustainable state of not accepting the role of background, which then leads to various chaoses that I think we see. So then, to close, what ends up happening then is if human beings require a background to excrete, to get the catharsis, and we deny ourselves the background, then the role of aliens then keeps us from leaning into a background that we need as human beings to feel a sort of catharsis in our operation. Thus, we become pathological, which then accelerates the social breakdown, because you're not making the background because of aliens, and you're not giving yourself ways to excrete, quote unquote, because you're not giving yourself the background to do that, because you would need that background to say what you truly are, to have conviction, to say, go do a hobby or a skill outside of the system. So without background, you're going to lack confidence, you're going to lack the ability to take your own stand, and thus you will probably not be able to go in that direction, and thus you'll be suppressed. And in that suppression, you could become pathological. So it is aliens, and that's why we need to banish the show Ancient Aliens on History. Way to go, History Channel. It's been a pleasure. I'm glad we could talk about it. Yeah, Brandon came at the right time. We talked about poop, aliens, backgrounds, agriculture, and fairies. So it really worked out.
All my favorite topics, yes.
We knew it. We knew it. Well, friends, it's been a pleasure. I'm going to go put an air conditioner in and make sure the car works. So Godspeed to all of you. I'm glad we could talk about everything.
Thank you,
you guys.
The role of aliens.